They were selling lakefront dreams on water they didn't own. The first thing that hit me wasn't the sound, it was the smell. Fresh-cut pine, wet sawdust, and that faint chemical bite of sealant drifting across the lake like it had every right to be there. I stood ankle-deep in the cool morning shallows, watching sunlight bounce off 14 brand-new cabin windows lined up along the curve of the shore like they'd always belonged. Champagne corks popped somewhere behind me, sharp and celebratory, echoing across the water in little bursts that didn't quite reach my side of the lake. Laughter followed. Confident. Expensive. The kind of laughter that assumes the deal is already done. I didn't move. Didn't say a word. Just let the water settle around my boots while their voices carried over the surface, distorted slightly, like the lake itself didn't fully agree with what it was hearing. Banners hung between two cedar posts near the main dock. Lake Serenity, grand opening. White fabric snapping lightly in the breeze, clean and perfect against the deep green treeline. They'd built everything fast. Faster than most people would think possible. 14 cabins in under 9 months. Gravel paths, private decks, polished railings, and every single one angled just right to catch the reflection of the lake at sunset. I had to admit, it looked good. That was the problem. It looked like it belonged. Maggie Holloway stood near the center of it all, heels pressed into the packed dirt like she owned gravity itself, a glass of something sparkling in her hand. Even from a distance, I could picture the expression on her face. That calm, practiced smile. The one that said everything was under control because she had already decided it was. I'd seen it before. Lexus parked just out of frame, probably still warm from the drive-in. Clipboard traded for contracts today. This wasn't enforcement anymore. This was profit. A group of buyers gathered around her, nodding, pointing toward the water, already imagining kayaks, morning coffee on those decks, their kids running down to the shoreline like it was theirs. That word, theirs. I let it sit in my head for a second, the way the lake holds a ripple before it disappears. Because that stretch of shoreline, the one every cabin leaned toward, the one every brochure promised as private lake access, wasn't part of their land. It never had been. The boundary wasn't where they thought it was. It never moved. They just chose not to see it. I shifted my weight, the small crunch of gravel under the water muted but familiar, and looked down at the thin line where sand met silt. I knew that line better than I knew most people. Knew how it changed after heavy rain, how it dipped in late summer, how the light hit it just before dusk. My father used to say the lake didn't care what was written on paper. Water remembers, he told me once, standing right where I was now, his boots half sunk the same way mine were. It remembers who it answers to. I hadn't thought about that in years. Not until the first time I saw their survey stakes pushed a little too close to the edge. Not until the morning I realized they weren't just building near the lake. They were building on the assumption they could use it. That was the moment this stopped being a mistake and became a decision. A very expensive one. The music picked up behind me, something light and polished, blending into the background like it was part of the landscape now. I stayed where I was, quiet, invisible from their angle, just another shadow along the waterline. They hadn't noticed me once during the entire build. Not when the first trees came down. Not when the foundations went in. Not when the docks extended just a little too far. I let them finish everything. Every nail. Every beam. Every promise printed in glossy ink. Because timing matters. And today was closing day. The day money moves. The day signatures turn assumptions into contracts. I lifted my gaze back to the row of cabins, sunlight flashing off glass, perfect reflections trembling on the surface in front of me. For a second, it almost looked like they were floating. Then the water shifted, just enough to break the illusion. And I smiled. Just slightly. Because what they didn't know was that none of those cabins had the right to touch this water. And in about an hour, everyone in that room was going to find out. I grew up measuring time by the way the light moved across this water, not by clocks or calendars. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I am 38 years old. And everything I understand about ownership did not come from a courthouse or a contract. It came from standing exactly where I was standing now, watching the shoreline breathe in and out with the seasons. My grandfather bought this land in 1962, back when this lake was nothing more than a quiet stretch of water surrounded by cedar and limestone, long before anyone thought to turn it into a destination. He did not just buy acreage. He bought the edge of something that could not be fenced, the thin strip where land gives up control and water takes over. That strip became the most important thing we owned, even if most people never noticed it. When I was a kid, my father would wake me up before sunrise, the air still cool enough to sting your lungs, and we would walk down to the water with a thermos of coffee that smelled stronger than anything I have ever tasted since. He would point to the line where the wet sand darkened and tell me, "That line matters more than anything on paper." At the time, I thought he meant it like a lesson about nature, something poetic. I did not realize he was teaching me something legal, something precise. Because what ran along this shoreline was not just dirt and rock. It was a recorded easement, filed decades before I was born, separating land ownership from water access in a way that most people never bother to understand until it is too late. While other families built fences and argued over property lines, mine learned how to read survey maps like they were family photos. I learned how to spot a misplaced stake from 20 yards away, how to feel when something was off just by the way the ground sloped under my boots. It was not obsession. It was inheritance. After college, I went into environmental engineering, partly because it felt like the natural extension of everything I had been taught here. Water systems, land use, flow control. The same principles, just scaled up. I spent years working on projects across Texas, managing drainage, analyzing flood patterns, designing systems that respected boundaries most people never even saw. But no matter where I went, I always came back to this lake. Always came back to this shoreline. Because this was the one place where the rules were not theoretical. They were personal. When my father passed, the property transferred to me without ceremony. No dramatic reading of a will, no complicated division. Just a quiet set of documents and a reminder that nothing had really changed except the name attached to it. I kept everything the same. Same gravel drive. Same dock. Same early mornings standing in the water, listening to the soft lap of waves against the bank. I did not need more than that. I did not want more than that. That is probably why I did not react the first time I saw the new survey flags on the far side of the cove. Bright orange, too close to the water, placed by someone who either did not know what they were doing or did not care. I remember crouching down, brushing my hand across the damp soil, feeling the subtle drop where the easement line should have been respected. It was off by just a few feet. Small enough that most people would ignore it. Big enough that I knew exactly what it meant. That was the first moment I understood this was not going to stay small. Not with people like Maggie involved. Not with money like that already moving behind the scenes. I stood up, looked across the water, and for a second I considered walking over, saying something, correcting it before it turned into something bigger. But I did not. Because some mistakes correct themselves. And some need to finish before they can be understood. So I went back to my routine. Kept working. Kept watching. And I let them build. Margaret Holloway did not arrive like a problem. She arrived like a solution. The first time I saw her in person, she was standing at the edge of the property line with a pair of sunglasses perched just high enough to signal she was observing, not participating, like the entire landscape was already a presentation she had approved. White Lexus parked at an angle that made it impossible to ignore, engine still ticking as it cooled in the Texas heat. She had that kind of presence that does not ask permission, it assumes alignment. Early 50s, controlled posture, voice smooth enough to pass for polite until you actually listened to what she was saying. "We are improving the community," she told a small group of homeowners gathered near the temporary site trailer. Her hands sweeping outward toward the lake like she had personally arranged the water to be there. "This area has been underutilized for years." Underutilized. I remember that word sticking with me, not because it was wrong, but because of how easily she said it, like decades of quiet ownership could be rewritten in a single sentence. Maggie did not operate alone. She never does. People like her build systems around themselves. Her husband sat on the county zoning board, not in a way that drew attention, but in a way that quietly adjusted outcomes. The development company handling the cabins had ties to two separate real estate groups in Austin, both known for moving fast and asking questions later. And then there was the HOA itself, Willow Ridge Estates, a name that sounded harmless until you realized it functioned more like a private governing body than a neighborhood association. Maggie had been president for 3 years, unopposed each term, which told you everything you needed to know about how much resistance she actually faced. The first time she spoke to me directly, she smiled like we were already in agreement. It was late afternoon, sun low enough to stretch shadows across the dirt where the first cabin foundations were being marked out. I had walked over, not to confront her, just to listen up close. "You must be Ethan," she said, extending a hand that was firm without being friendly. "I have heard you own the adjacent land." Adjacent. Another word carefully chosen. I nodded, said nothing more than my name, and waited. "You are going to love what we are doing here," she continued, gesturing toward the flagged layout, the lines already creeping closer to the water than they should have been. "This is going to bring real value to the entire area. Property values, tourism, long-term growth." She spoke in layers, each one designed to sound reasonable on its own, but together they formed something else entirely. Not a proposal, a declaration. I glanced down at the nearest survey stake, its position just a few feet inside where the easement line should have pushed it back. Small enough to deny, precise enough to matter. "You had a survey done?" I asked, keeping my tone even. She smiled again, a fraction tighter this time. "Of course. Everything is fully compliant." That was the moment I understood how she operated. Not by ignoring the rules, but by bending them just far enough that challenging her would cost more than most people were willing to spend. She was counting on that. Counting on people choosing convenience over correction. Counting on silence. Around us, the crew kept working. The metallic clang of tools, the low hum of a generator, the smell of fuel mixing with the scent of cut cedar. It all blended into something that felt permanent, even though it was still just the beginning. Maggie adjusted her sunglasses, looked back toward the water, and for a brief second her gaze followed the same line mine always did, right to the edge where land met lake. But she did not see it the way I did. To her, it was an amenity. To me, it was a boundary that had never moved. "We are going to make this place something special," she said, almost to herself. I did not argue. I did not point out the discrepancy. I did not mention the easement. I just nodded once, turned, and walked back toward my side of the shoreline, the soft crunch of gravel under my boots grounding me in something she had not accounted for. Because Maggie Holloway believed she was building value. What she was actually building was exposure. The first real sign that this was no longer just a boundary issue came 3 weeks later, just after sunrise, when the sound of engines started earlier than usual and did not stop. I was halfway through my morning coffee, standing on the back deck, when I heard the low, steady rumble of heavy equipment rolling in from the access road, deeper and more aggressive than anything they had used before. By the time I made it down to the shoreline, the air already carried that sharp, dusty smell of disturbed earth mixed with diesel, thick enough to taste. 2 excavators had positioned themselves along the curve of the cove, their long arms reaching out like they were measuring something that did not belong to them, while a crew worked quickly behind them, driving new stakes into the ground closer to the water than I had seen yet. Not inches this time. Feet. Deliberate. I stopped at the edge of the easement line, boots sinking slightly into the damp sand, and watched as one of the machines carved a shallow cut along the shoreline, flattening the natural slope that had been there for decades into something clean, engineered, and completely wrong. The sound of metal teeth scraping through gravel echoed across the lake, sharp and mechanical, replacing the soft rhythm of water I had known my entire life. A man in a hard hat waved at me like this was normal, like I was just another neighbor watching progress. "We are grading for the private access path," he called out, raising his voice over the engine noise, confident in a way that told me he had been given instructions, not context. Private access. I let that phrase sit for a second, then looked down at the ground beneath my feet, tracing the invisible line in my head where their authority ended and mine began. They were on the wrong side of it now. Not by accident. Not by a misunderstanding. This was a decision. I walked a few steps closer, enough that the wet sand darkened around my boots, and the temperature dropped just slightly from the proximity to the water. The excavator paused for a moment, its engine idling, and for a brief second everything went quiet except for the faint lap of the lake against the disturbed edge. It looked different already. Flatter. Less alive. Like someone had taken something organic and forced it into a straight line. I could feel the shift in my chest, that familiar tightening that comes when something fundamental is being altered in a way that cannot be undone. I should have said something right then. Should have pointed to the line, explained the easement, corrected the mistake before it spread any further. But I did not. Because the moment I spoke, This would turn into a negotiation. And negotiation was exactly what Maggie was counting on. I stepped back instead, letting the water reclaim the space around my boots as I moved, and watched them continue. The machines roared back to life, pushing farther along the shoreline, reshaping it piece by piece into something that matched their plans instead of reality. Behind them, another crew started laying out wooden forms for what looked like a narrow walkway, angled perfectly to lead future buyers straight from their cabins down to the water. Every measurement was intentional, every angle calculated, and every inch of it sat inside a strip of land they did not control. By midday, the change was impossible to ignore. The natural curve of the cove had been replaced with a clean, accessible edge, and the first sections of the path were already taking shape, pale boards stretching out toward the lake like an invitation that should never have been extended. I stood there longer than I meant to, listening to the hum of generators, the rhythmic thud of hammers, the constant movement of a project that believed it was unstoppable. And that was when it became clear. This was no longer a misunderstanding about property lines. This was a full commitment. They were not testing boundaries anymore. They were rewriting them. And once you go that far, you do not get to pretend it was an accident. You own the outcome. I turned away without a word, the sound of their work fading behind me as I walked back up the path, already knowing one thing with absolute certainty. This was not going to end with a conversation. I did try, just once, to handle it the way most people would. Not because I believed it would work, but because part of me needed to confirm exactly how far they were willing to push it. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I drove into the temporary site office, a portable unit set up just off the gravel road with a set of freshly printed plans pinned to the wall like they were already permanent. The air inside smelled like cheap air conditioning and printer ink, a sharp contrast to the natural scent of the lake just a few hundred yards away. Maggie was there, of course, seated behind a folding desk that somehow looked intentional, like she could turn any space into authority just by sitting in it. She glanced up as I stepped in, that same composed expression settling into place before I even said a word. "Ethan," she said, like she had been expecting me. "What can I do for you?" I did not waste time. I laid out what I had seen, kept my voice level, precise, the way I would present findings in any professional setting. I explained the shoreline boundary, the easement, the fact that their grading and construction had crossed into a controlled strip that was not part of their property rights. I even referenced the original plat recordings, the ones tied to my grandfather's purchase, thinking maybe, just maybe, this was a gap in their understanding. Maggie listened without interrupting, fingers lightly resting on the edge of the desk, eyes steady, the picture of patience. When I finished, she gave a small nod, like I had just completed a presentation she already knew the outcome of. "I appreciate you bringing this to our attention," she said, her tone warm but distant, like a customer service script delivered perfectly. "However, our legal team has reviewed all boundaries and we are fully compliant with county records." There it was. Not a discussion, a conclusion. I held her gaze for a moment, letting the silence stretch just enough to make it clear I was not guessing. "Your survey is wrong," I said, not louder, just more direct. "You are inside a recorded easement. That strip is not yours to build on, and it is not yours to sell access from." For a fraction of a second, something shifted behind her eyes. Not doubt, recognition. And then it was gone, replaced by that same polished confidence. She leaned back slightly, crossing one leg over the other, completely at ease. "If that were the case," she replied, "I am sure it would have come up during permitting." Smooth, dismissive, final. She was not engaging with the substance of what I was saying. She was leaning on process, on the assumption that if something had been approved, it could not be wrong. Or at least, it could not be challenged without significant effort. "Permitting does not override recorded easements," I said, keeping my tone steady. "Those are separate." She smiled again, a little sharper this time, like we had reached the part of the conversation she was more comfortable with. "Then you are welcome to pursue that through the appropriate channels," she said. "But in the meantime, construction will continue." That was it. No offer to review documents. No request to compare records. Just a polite invitation to spend time and money proving something she already understood. I nodded once, because there was nothing else to say. The conversation had not failed because of a misunderstanding. It had failed because she knew exactly what she was doing and had already decided the risk was worth it. As I turned to leave, I glanced at the plans on the wall one more time. Every cabin labeled, every path drawn cleanly. Down to the water, every detail aligned with a version of reality that ignored the one thing that mattered most. Outside, the late afternoon heat hit me immediately, thick and heavy, carrying the distant sound of hammers and saws that had not paused for even a second. They were not slowing down. They were accelerating. By the time I reached my truck, I already knew what that conversation had really confirmed. This was not a mistake I could correct early. This was a strategy one had to let play out. Because once they chose to keep building after being warned, they were no longer just crossing a line. They were investing in being wrong. And investments like that only make sense, right up until the moment they collapse. After that meeting, everything sped up in a way that almost felt intentional, like they were racing against something they could not quite name. Within a week, the framing was complete on all 14 cabins, clean lines rising out of the ground where natural brush had stood for decades. Each structure positioned with calculated precision to maximize the view they did not actually control. The sound of construction changed too, shifting from heavy machinery to something sharper and more constant. The rapid staccato of nail guns, the hollow echo of boards being set into place, the steady hum of progress that never seemed to pause. Even at dusk, when the lights softened and the lake usually settled into silence, there was still movement, still the low buzz of generators and the occasional burst of activity that carried across the water like a reminder that this was not slowing down. I started noticing the details they were adding, the kind that only show up when a project is no longer just being built, but prepared to be sold. Fresh gravel paths laid down in smooth, even layers. Exterior lights installed along the walkways, casting warm pools of light that reflected off the water in a way that looked almost cinematic. Wooden railings sanded down to a finish so clean it caught the sunset and held it for a second longer than it should have. They were not just building cabins. They were building an experience. And every part of that experience pointed directly at the shoreline. The path they had cut along the edge was now fully formed, a continuous stretch of pale wood running just inside the easement, wide enough for two people to walk side by side, designed to guide future owners from their front doors straight to the water like it was a natural extension of their property. I walked that path one evening after the crews had left, my boots making a soft, hollow sound against the boards, each step reinforcing how deliberate this had all become. From certain angles, it was easy to forget where the actual boundary was. That was the point. They were not just crossing the line physically. They were erasing it visually. By the end of the month, the marketing started. It began quietly at first, a few signs near the entrance road, a simple website with polished photos and phrases that felt carefully chosen. Exclusive lakefront living. Private water access. A rare opportunity to own a piece of serenity. I saw one of the listings on my phone late one night, the glow of the screen reflecting faintly in the window behind me as I scrolled through images of the cabins I had been watching go up board by board. There it was, plain as anything, written like it was fact. Private lake access. I set the phone down and looked out toward the shoreline, barely visible in the dark except for the faint outline of the new path catching the moonlight. That was when the scale of it fully settled in. This was not just about where they had built. It was about what they were promising. And promises like that do not just create expectations. They create liability. Over the next few weeks, cars started showing up on weekends, slow-moving lines of visitors pulling in to tour the property, stepping out in clean shoes onto fresh gravel, looking around with that mix of curiosity and anticipation that always comes before a purchase. I watched from a distance as agents walked them down the path, gesturing toward the water, painting a picture of mornings on the lake and evenings by the shore, every word reinforcing a reality that did not exist. Some of them knelt near the edge, reaching down to touch the water like they were already claiming it. I did not interrupt. I did not correct them. I just stood back, letting it all unfold exactly the way Maggie needed it to. Because every tour, every listing, every signed intent added another layer to what was coming. They were not just building structures anymore. They were building assumptions. And the more those assumptions solidified, the more precise the timing had to be. By the time the first contracts were scheduled to close, everything looked finished, complete, certain. From the outside, there was no sign of risk, no visible crack in the system they had created. Just a row of perfect cabins, a polished path to the water, and a group of buyers ready to believe it was all theirs. And that was exactly when it mattered most that I had said nothing. The shift did not happen all at once. It happened in a detail so small most people would have missed it completely. It was early, just after sunrise, the kind of quiet morning where the lake sits perfectly still, holding the sky like glass. I was walking the shoreline the way I always did, following that invisible line out of habit more than necessity, when I noticed something different near the midpoint of the cove. A metal survey pin, partially exposed, catching the light just enough to draw my attention. It was not new. In fact, it was old enough that the top had dulled from years of weather, the edges softened, almost blending into the surrounding ground. I crouched down, brushing away a thin layer of damp sand, and felt that familiar shape under my fingers. Solid. Fixed. Exactly where it was supposed to be. I had seen it before, years ago, but not like this, not in contrast to everything they had built around it. I straightened up slowly and looked out toward the cabins, their clean lines and fresh wood standing in sharp contrast to this one quiet piece of evidence that had not moved at all. That was the moment the entire picture snapped into focus, not just the fact that they were wrong, but exactly how wrong they were. Because this was not just about a boundary being crossed. This pin marked the original easement reference point, the one tied directly to the recorded documents my grandfather had filed decades ago. And everything they had built, every path, every access point, every promise of shoreline use, extended well beyond it. I took a few steps along the water, pacing out the distance the way I had been taught, counting in my head, matching what I saw to what I remembered from the old plats. 10 feet, 15, 20. By the time I reached the start of their walkway, the difference was no longer subtle. It was undeniable. The entire access path, the one guiding buyers straight to the water, sat completely inside the easement strip. Not partially. Completely. I could feel a slow, steady clarity settle in, the kind that replaces frustration with something much sharper. Because this was no longer a situation that required interpretation. This was measurable, verifiable, absolute. I walked back up the bank and pulled out my phone, not to call anyone, just to take a few photos, careful, methodical, capturing angles that showed both the pin and the structures in the same frame. Evidence, but more importantly, context. The kind that cannot be explained away with a confident tone or a polished statement. As I stood there, the first crew truck of the day rolled in behind me, tires crunching over gravel, the familiar sound marking the start of another day of work they believed was moving them closer to completion. One of the workers stepped out, nodded in my direction, completely unaware of what I had just confirmed. To them, this was just another job, another site, another set of plans to follow. They were not the ones making the decision. They were just carrying it out. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and took one last look at the shoreline, the real line, the one that had been there long before any of this started. It had not shifted. It had not adjusted. It had simply been ignored. And that is what made it powerful. Because ignoring something does not erase it. It just delays the moment you have to face it. I turned and headed back up the path, the early morning air still cool, the smell of damp earth rising with each step. And for the first time since this started, I was not thinking about whether they were wrong. I was thinking about when it would matter most to prove it. Because now I had something more than suspicion. I had a fixed point. A line that could not be argued, only acknowledged. And once you have that, everything else becomes timing. Once I had that reference point, everything changed from observation to confirmation, and confirmation has a way of sharpening your focus. That afternoon, I pulled out the old records, not from memory this time, but from the actual documents stored in a weathered metal cabinet in my office, the same cabinet my father used, the same one that still smelled faintly of paper, dust, and time every time it opened. I laid the plats out across the desk, edges curling slightly from age, lines drawn with a precision that did not rely on modern software, but held up better than most of what people use now. There it was, clear and undeniable, the shoreline easement defined in exact measurements, tied to fixed markers, including the very pin I had uncovered that morning. I traced the line slowly with my finger, following it across the map, visualizing how it translated to the land outside, matching each segment to the curve of the cove I knew so well. Then I overlaid what they had built, not physically, but mentally, aligning cabins, paths, and access points with the boundaries in front of me. The result was not close. It was not arguable. It was complete overlap. I sat back for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the room, the faint tick of the clock on the wall, letting that realization settle fully. This was not a minor encroachment. This was total reliance on something they did not have the right to use. I reached for my laptop and pulled up the county records, navigating through layers of filings until I found the easement registration, still active, still binding, still exactly as it had been recorded decades ago. No amendments. No releases. No transfers. It had never been altered, which meant it still carried the same authority it always had. I downloaded copies, cross-checked parcel numbers, confirmed coordinates, and then compared them against the most recent survey data available for the development. That was where the gap became even more obvious. Their survey acknowledged the property lines, but it treated the easement like a non-factor, as if it existed on paper but not in practice. And that told me everything I needed to know. This was not ignorance. This was omission. I printed everything, stacking documents in a clean, ordered set, each page reinforcing the same point from a different angle. Maps, legal descriptions, recorded filings, photographs from that morning. Individually, each piece mattered. Together, they formed something much stronger. Proof that did not rely on interpretation, only on recognition. I spent the next few days refining it, organizing the information in a way that would be impossible to dismiss with a quick answer or a confident tone. Every detail had to lead to the same conclusion, no matter where someone started reading. At the same time, the activity outside continued exactly as before, which only made the contrast sharper. Trucks coming and going, final touches being added, staging furniture appearing inside the cabins, all of it signaling that they were moving from construction to presentation. I drove past one evening and saw lights glowing through the windows, warm and inviting. Reflections dancing across the water in a way that made the entire development look complete, settled, unquestionable. That was the illusion they were selling. And it was a good one. Good enough that most people would never think to question it. But I was not most people, and this was not just any piece of land. This was a fixed system with rules that did not change just because someone decided they were inconvenient. By the time I finished compiling everything, I was not thinking about whether I could prove it anymore. I was thinking about how it would land when it mattered most. Because evidence on its own does nothing. It is timing that turns it into something else. And with closing day approaching, that timing was getting very specific. By the time everything was organized, I knew I could not do this alone, not because I lacked proof, but because the right kind of pressure requires the right kind of presence. So I reached out to someone I had not spoken to in years, a surveyor named Daniel Reeves, a man who treated boundary lines like they were sacred, not suggestions. His office sat just outside town, a low brick building with stacks of rolled maps visible through the front window, the kind of place that had seen more land disputes than most courtrooms. When I walked in, the familiar smell of paper and ink hit me immediately, grounding in a way that reminded me I was on the right track. Daniel looked up from his desk, studied me for a second, and then nodded like no time had passed at all. "Ethan Caldwell," he said, setting his pen down. "If you are here, something is off." I did not waste time. I laid the documents out in front of him, starting with the original plat, then the easement filing, then the photographs I had taken along the shoreline. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing slightly as he traced the lines with a practiced hand, not rushing, not guessing, just reading the land through ink the way he always had. The room stayed quiet except for the faint sound of paper shifting under his fingers. After a few minutes, he sat back, exhaled once, and looked at me with a clarity that confirmed what I already knew. "They did not miss this," he said. "They ignored it." That distinction mattered. Missing something can be corrected. Ignoring something means you made a choice. He stood up, walked over to a cabinet, and pulled out a recent county survey file, spreading it next to mine. "Here is what they submitted for permitting," he said, tapping the page lightly. "Notice how the easement is referenced but not enforced in the layout." I leaned in, seeing it immediately, the quiet gap between acknowledgement and action. They knew the line existed. They just built as if it did not apply. Daniel shook his head slightly, not in disbelief, but in recognition. "They are betting nobody pushes back hard enough to make it matter," he said. "And by the time anyone does, they expect everything to be sold." That was the strategy. Not denial. Delay. I nodded, already thinking ahead. What happens when it does matter? I asked. He gave a short, almost humorless smile. Then it is not a construction problem anymore, he said. It is a title problem. And title problems stop money. That was the first time the full weight of it was put into words. Not just a legal issue. A financial one. Something that could freeze an entire transaction in place the moment it was recognized. I gathered the papers slowly, stacking them back into order. Each page now carrying more than just information. They carried timing. Daniel watched me for a second, then added one more thing, his tone quieter this time. If you are going to do this, he said, do not do it early. Do it when it hurts. I held his gaze for a moment, understanding exactly what he meant without needing anything else explained. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows. Across the parking lot, the air warm and still, the kind of calm that settles right before something shifts. I thanked him, walked back to my truck, and sat there for a minute without starting the engine, looking down at the stack of documents in my hands. Everything was in place now. The line, the proof, the confirmation. The only thing left was the moment. Because up until now, this had been about being right. But from here on out, it was about being precise. And precision is not about acting fast. It is about acting at exactly the right time. Once the plan became clear, everything I did after that looked like nothing at all from the outside. And that was exactly how it needed to be. I stopped visiting the shoreline during peak hours, stopped walking the edge when buyers were touring, stopped giving anyone a reason to notice me at all. From their perspective, I had stepped back, accepted the outcome, moved on the way most people do when they realize they are outmatched by time, money, and momentum. That assumption was part of the plan. Because the less I appeared involved, the more confident they became that there was nothing left to challenge. Meanwhile, I focused on the details that actually mattered. I contacted a title company in Austin, not to file anything yet, just to confirm process. Quiet conversations. Specific questions. What triggers a review? What pauses a closing? What documentation forces a reassessment before funds are released? The answers were consistent across the board. If a valid encumbrance affecting access or use is introduced at the point of closing, it does not get ignored. It gets investigated. An investigation means delay. Delay means uncertainty. And uncertainty is the one thing deals like this cannot tolerate. I made sure every document I had was clean, legible, and ordered in a way that told the story without explanation. Original plat first. Easement filing second. County confirmation third. Then photographs, recent and time-stamped, showing the physical overlap in a way that could not be argued. No clutter. No emotion. Just sequence. Because the stronger the structure, the less anyone can deflect it. As closing day approached, the activity at the site shifted again, this time away from construction entirely and into presentation. Landscaping crews trimmed every edge, smoothing out anything that looked too raw, too unfinished. Outdoor furniture appeared on decks, carefully arranged to suggest a life that had not started yet but felt immediate. The path to the water was cleaned, swept, even washed down in sections, its pale boards almost glowing under the late afternoon sun. It was no longer a job site. It was a finished product. I drove past once, slowly, windows down, letting the sounds carry in. Lighter now. Quieter. Conversations instead of machinery. Doors opening and closing. The faint hum of staged air conditioning units running inside cabins that were about to be handed over to people who believed they understood exactly what they were buying. I did not stop. I did not look too long. Just enough to confirm what I already knew. Everything was ready. That night, I laid the documents out one more time on my kitchen table, the same way I had done in my office, checking each page, each detail, not for new information, but for clarity. The lake outside was still, reflecting the faint glow of the cabins across the water, a perfect mirror of something that looked complete but was not grounded in reality. I could see the path from here, a thin line of light leading straight to the shoreline, guiding people towards something they did not have the right to use. I let that image sit for a moment, then gathered the papers into a single folder, clean, structured, final. The next morning would not be about proving anything new. It would be about placing what already existed into the exact moment it could not be ignored. Because up until now, they had been operating on assumption, on confidence. on the belief that no one would interrupt the process once it reached this stage. But processes are only as strong as the information they are built on. And if that information changes at the right time, everything built on top of it has to stop. I turned off the lights, leaving the room in darkness except for the faint outline of the lake beyond the window. And for the first time since this started, there was no tension left in it. No uncertainty, just timing. And morning was coming fast. Closing day did not announce itself with noise. It arrived with a kind of quiet precision that felt almost ceremonial. The office they used was not at the site, but a few miles away, a clean, controlled space with glass walls, polished floors, and that faint scent of coffee and paper that always hangs in places where money is about to change hands. I walked in early, not rushed, not hesitant, just steady, the folder in my hand feeling lighter than it should have after everything it contained. Inside, a few people were already seated around the table, buyers mostly, well-dressed, composed, reviewing documents with the kind of focus that comes from believing everything has already been verified. A title officer sat near the end, laptop open, files organized, ready to move the process forward the moment signatures aligned. And then there was Maggie, standing near the head of the table, speaking in that same calm, confident tone I had heard from the beginning. Guiding the room through the final steps like this was just another successful project reaching its conclusion. She noticed me as soon as I stepped in. Just a flicker at first, a brief pause in her expression before it settled back into place, controlled, measured. She did not greet me. She did not need to. The question was already there, unspoken, hanging in the space between us. I did not sit. I waited until the conversation reached that point where everything slows just before the final signatures, that moment where the room collectively leans forward, ready to close. That was when I stepped in, placing the folder on the table with a soft, deliberate motion that drew just enough attention without disrupting the tone completely. Before this moves forward, I said, my voice even, clear, carrying just enough to reach everyone without forcing it. There is something that needs to be reviewed. The room shifted slightly, not dramatically, just enough to break the rhythm they had settled into. The title officer looked up first, then the buyers, then finally Maggie, her posture tightening just a fraction, her eyes locking onto the folder like she already understood what it contained. I opened it slowly, not for effect, but for clarity, laying out the documents one by one in the same order I had prepared them, each page aligned, each detail visible. This property includes a recorded shoreline easement. I continued, sliding the original plat forward, followed by the filing, then the photographs. It defines a fixed access strip along the water that is not owned by the development and cannot be used or sold as private lake access. Silence settled in, not immediate, but building, the kind that grows as information replaces assumption. The title officer leaned forward, scanning the documents, fingers moving quickly across the pages, cross-referencing, verifying. One of the buyers shifted in his seat, glancing toward the window as if the lake itself might look different now that this had been said. Maggie did not speak right away. She held her position, eyes moving over the documents with a level of focus that confirmed she recognized every line of what was in front of her. When she finally did speak, her voice was still controlled, but the edges had changed. We have already completed all necessary surveys and approvals, she said, careful, precise, choosing each word like it still held weight. The title officer did not look up. We need to pause, she said instead, her tone professional but firm, already shifting from process to problem. This affects access rights tied to the property. We cannot proceed without clarification. That was it. No raised voices. No dramatic reaction. Just a single sentence that stopped everything. The room held there for a moment, suspended between what they thought they had and what they were now being told they did not. I closed the folder halfway, leaving the documents visible, not as a statement, but as a fact that no longer needed explanation. And for the first time since this started, the illusion broke. Not loudly, not suddenly, but completely. The shift in the room did not come with raised voices or sudden movement. It came with hesitation, the kind that spreads quietly when certainty disappears. The title officer continued reviewing the documents, her posture changing almost imperceptibly as she moved from assumption to verification, each page turning slower than the last. One of the buyers leaned forward, his earlier confidence replaced by a measured concern, eyes moving between the papers and Maggie as if waiting for her to restore the situation with a single explanation. But Maggie did not move. She stood exactly where she had been, shoulders squared, expression controlled, yet something underneath it had shifted, something tighter, more calculated. "This is a standard easement," she said finally, her tone calm, but now carrying a trace of urgency. "It does not impact the ownership of the structures." The title officer looked up then, meeting her gaze directly for the first time since the documents were placed on the table. "It impacts access," she replied, precise and firm. "And access is part of what is being sold." That distinction settled over the room like a weight. Not dramatic, not loud, just undeniable. The buyers exchanged quick glances, subtle but telling, their earlier excitement replaced by something more cautious, more analytical. One of them reached for the listing brochure on the table, flipping it open to the page that highlighted the shoreline, the exact feature that had drawn them here in the first place. I watched as the realization began to take shape, not all at once, but in pieces, each one connecting to the next until the picture they had been given no longer held together. The title officer closed the folder halfway, not as a conclusion, but as a pause, her fingers resting on the edge as she spoke again. "We cannot ensure clear use of the shoreline as presented," she said. "Until this is resolved, we cannot proceed with closing." That was the moment everything stopped. Not just the conversation, the entire transaction. It did not collapse. It suspended, held in place by a single condition that could not be bypassed. Maggie exhaled slowly, a controlled breath, her composure still intact, but now working harder to hold its shape. "We can address this after closing," she offered, shifting the timeline in a way that might have worked under different circumstances. The title officer shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "This has to be resolved before funds are released." The room went still again, but this time it was different. Not confusion. Recognition. The kind that settles when people understand they are no longer dealing with a minor issue, but a structural one. One of the buyers leaned back, arms crossing loosely, not defensive, just reconsidering. Another glance toward the window again, the lake visible in the distance, unchanged, untouched by the conversation unfolding around it. I remained where I was, silent, letting the information do what it was designed to do. There was nothing left to explain, nothing left to argue. The documents spoke for themselves, and more importantly, they spoke at the exact moment they needed to be heard. Maggie's gaze shifted toward me briefly, not anger, not even frustration, but something closer to acknowledgement, the realization that this had not been an interruption, it had been a decision carried out with precision. Around us, the room adjusted, conversations lowering, timelines dissolving. The process that had felt inevitable just minutes ago now uncertain, conditional, incomplete. And in that quiet, controlled space, with everything still technically in place yet unable to move forward, the outcome finally revealed itself. Not through force, not through confrontation, but through the simple fact that what they were selling could not be delivered. By the time I stepped out of that office, nothing had exploded, nothing had collapsed in the dramatic way people expect when something goes wrong. But everything had shifted in a way that could not be undone. The air outside felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because the outcome had already started to ripple outward, quiet and irreversible. I stood there for a moment, letting the stillness settle, then drove back toward the lake without urgency, without the need to rush anything that had already been set in motion. When I reached the property, the cabins looked exactly the same as they had the day before, clean lines, polished wood, sunlight reflecting off glass like nothing had touched them. But something had changed, not in the structures, but in what they represented. A few cars were still parked along the gravel, buyers lingering, conversations lower now, more measured, the tone no longer centered on excitement, but on clarification. I walked past them without stopping, following the path they had built, the boards still smooth under my boots, the line leading straight toward the water as it always had. But now, that path felt different. Not like an invitation. More like a question that had finally been answered. When I reached the shoreline, I stepped off the wood and into the damp sand, the temperature dropping just slightly as the lake met my boots, the same familiar sensation I had known my entire life. The water moved the way it always did, small ripples breaking against the edge, indifferent to everything that had just happened. I looked back over my shoulder at the row of cabins, their reflections stretching across the surface, perfectly aligned, almost convincing if you did not know where the line actually was. That was the thing about it. From the right angle, everything still looked complete, still looked like it worked. But reality does not depend on perspective. It depends on what holds when it is tested. Behind me, I could hear fragments of conversation, phrases like access rights and review process, carrying just far enough to confirm what I already knew. The deals were not moving forward. Not today. Not until something fundamental changed. And that kind of change does not happen quickly. It requires renegotiation, restructuring, sometimes abandonment. All things that cost time. All things that cost money. I walked a few steps along the shoreline, tracing that invisible line again, the one that had never moved, never adjusted, never responded to pressure or assumption. It was still exactly where it had always been, quiet, consistent, waiting. My father used to say that land teaches patience if you are willing to listen, that not everything needs to be forced into motion to reach an outcome. Standing there now, I understood that better than I ever had. I did not need to argue. I did not need to raise my voice. I just needed to let the truth arrive at the moment it could not be ignored. I stopped near the old survey pin, the one that had marked the turning point, and looked out across the water one more time. The cabins stood behind me, unchanged in form, but completely different in value. Because without what they promised, they were just structures near a lake, not part of it. And that difference, small as it seemed, was everything. I let out a slow breath, the air cool against my skin, and turned back toward the path, the sound of water fading behind me as I stepped onto the boards again. Some people think justice has to be loud to be real, that it needs confrontation, conflict, something visible. But standing there, with everything already decided without a single raised voice, I knew something else entirely. Justice does not rush. It does not force itself into the moment. It waits, it watches, and when the time is right, it simply holds.